Not. Listen, there's a locomotive engineer somewhere in Kansas right now who hasn't slept in his own bed for 6 days. And as the mid-May humidity begins to settle over the tallgrass prairie, he's watching the artificial glow of a phone on a stained nightstand. When that device buzzes at 2:47 in the morning, the vibration cutting through the silence of a cheap motel room like a serrated blade, he doesn't reach for it with hope. He reaches for it out of survival. He has to report to the yard by 4:15 a.m. There is no negotiation, no calling in, and no grace period. If he doesn't show, he loses points. If he loses enough points, he loses a six-figure career he spent 14 years of his life building, and his mortgage company doesn't care that he promised his daughter he'd finally be at her basketball game this weekend. This is the modern American railroad in the spring of 2026, where the vibrant green of the Flint Hills is nothing more than a blurred streak outside a cab window. Somewhere around year 8 of this relentless cycle, his wife stopped asking when he'd be home, because the answer was always a scripted tragedy. I don't know. Depends on when they call. Could be tonight. Could be 3 days from now. I'll let you know when I know. She isn't his wife anymore. Most of the men he hired on with are either divorced or currently navigating the paperwork. And those who remain married have spouses who surrendered to the reality that loving a railroader means coming in fourth place, behind the carrier, the dispatcher, and the federal hours of service clock. If there is anything left of a man after a 60-hour week of unpredictable starts, maybe his family gets a piece of it on a holiday, provided the freight boards are slow and the weather doesn't knock out a signal bridge. It is a grueling, invisible tax on the human soul, and yet the major Class 1 railroads seem genuinely baffled as to why the talent pipeline has dried up and why the recruitment offices are empty. If you had told a veteran engineer in 1975 that his profession would eventually become one of the most difficult jobs to fill in the United States, he would have looked at you like you'd lost your mind. Back then, a railroad job was a golden inheritance. It was a lineage of steel and grease. Your father worked the line, his father before him, and when you handed in your high school jersey, you walked straight into the hiring office to put your name on the list, because that's what people did in a town built on tracks. The pay was a benchmark for the middle class, the health benefits were the envy of every other industry, and the pension was a rock-solid promise of a quiet retirement. Yes, the hours were rough, and the weather was often your enemy, but there was a fundamental social contract. You sacrificed your time, and in exchange, the railroad gave you a life of dignity and stability. You were the heartbeat of the nation, moving every ton of coal and every car of grain that kept the lights on and the tables full. There was an immense, quiet pride in sitting in that cab, watching the miles of the American interior roll by while the rest of the world slept. But that contract wasn't broken all at once. It was dismantled piece by piece over the last 2 decades. The men who are still out there, the ones holding the throttles of 3-mile-long trains, can tell you exactly when the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a creeping frost that settled into the yards and the break rooms. It started with minor productivity tweaks and ended with a radical transformation of the industry's DNA. A shift that turned a proud vocation into a desperate war of attrition between those who moved the freight and those who managed the numbers. The shift happened around 2015, and it felt less like an evolution and more like a controlled demolition of the industry's culture. In the sterile glass towers of Wall Street, executives began preaching the gospel of precision-scheduled railroading, or PSR, a term that sounds like a miracle of modern logistics, but felt like a chokehold to the people on the ground. The logic was deceptively simple. Run fewer trains, but make those trains much longer and heavier. Cut the fat by closing yards and furloughing staff, and focus entirely on a metric called the operating ratio. To a CEO presenting a quarterly earnings call, a lower operating ratio meant efficiency and massive dividends. To an engineer in the yard, it meant the end of a manageable life. Wall Street fell in love with the numbers, and stock prices soared as railroads began cannibalizing their own infrastructure and human capital to squeeze every penny out of the balance sheet. But the physics of the rails didn't change just because a spreadsheet said they should. Suddenly, the trains that used to be a mile long were being stretched to 2, then 3 miles in length, becoming monstrous 3,000-ton snakes of steel that require superhuman focus to manage. When you have 15,000 feet of train behind you, you aren't just driving, you are managing a massive, oscillating wave of kinetic energy where the front of the train might be climbing a grade while the rear is still pushing down a hill, creating draft and buff forces that can snap a knuckle or derail a car if you breathe on the dynamic brake too hard. The margin for error vanished, replaced by a relentless pressure to keep moving at all costs. Between 2018 and 2020, Union Pacific alone cut nearly 12,000 jobs, and the work didn't just disappear. It was simply loaded onto the backs of the survivors. The shop politics turned toxic as the family atmosphere of the railroad was replaced by a rigid algorithmic management style that viewed employees as liabilities rather than assets. This was the era where attendance policies became weaponized. BNSF introduced a system called high-vis, a points-based attendance regime that effectively ended the concept of a weekend or a sick day. Every employee started with a fixed number of points, and any time you were unavailable for a call, whether it was for a child's surgery, a personal illness, or sheer physical exhaustion, the system docked you. If you hit 0, you were fired. It created a permanent state of high-stakes gambling, where railroaders had to weigh their family's health against their career stability. One Texas engineer famously described it as living in a shadow, where the only thing you could count on was the fact that as soon as your federally mandated rest period ended, the phone would ring and you'd be back in the cab. The money, which used to be the reward for the hard work, started to feel like a bribe to keep people from walking away from a life that no longer had room for them. You might be making $140,000 a year, but when you're standing in a grocery store aisle at 3 a.m., because that's the only time you're home and awake, you start to realize that the railroad isn't just buying your labor, it's buying your existence. The pressure of the timetable became an all-consuming fire. If a train sits for more than a few minutes, it's costing the company thousands of dollars in dwell time, and that pressure is funneled directly into the headset of the engineer. You are told to do more with less, to run longer trains with less maintenance, and to do it all while being one missed phone call away from the unemployment line. The shop floors, once places of mentorship and shared history, became quiet and tense, filled with men and women who were just trying to survive until their next period of rest, knowing that the precision in the system was never meant for their benefit. The machine doesn't care about your sleep schedule or your divorce papers. It only understands the uncompromising laws of physics and the brutal limits of high tensile steel. To understand why this job is breaking the people who do it, you have to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of the equipment they are tasked with commanding. A modern Tier 4 locomotive is a masterpiece of industrial engineering, a 6-axle behemoth packing a 16-cylinder diesel engine that generates 4,400 horsepower and upwards of 200,000 pounds of starting tractive effort. But in the era of precision-scheduled railroading, 1 or 2 of these units isn't enough. The railroads now lash together 4, 5, or 6 units to pull monster trains that can exceed 20,000 tons. When you are sitting in the lead cab, you are responsible for a kinetic mass that behaves more like a liquid than a solid. The primary challenge is managing the slack co, the few inches of movement in the coupling mechanism of every single car. A 3-mile-long consist, that slack can total nearly 100 feet. If an engineer transitions from throttle to brake too quickly, that 100 feet of dead space bunches up or snaps out with the force of a small explosion, enough to shear a steel knuckle weighing 80 pounds or jackknife a car off the rails. On a steep mountain grade, the technical stakes reach a fever pitch. To keep 20,000 tons from becoming a runaway disaster, the engineer relies on dynamic braking, which reverses the traction motors to turn the train's momentum into electricity. That energy is then dissipated as heat through massive resistor grids on the roof of the locomotive. These grids can reach thermal limits where they literally glow orange against the night sky. If they overheat and fail, the engineer is forced to rely entirely on the air brakes. But air brakes are a finite resource. Every time you apply and release them, you deplete the air pressure in the reservoirs under each car. If you piss away your air by over-braking on a descent, you lose the ability to stop the train entirely. It is a high-wire act performed in a dark cab while fighting the fog of 60 hours of sleep deprivation. Then there are the failures that no computer can predict. One of the most dreaded is the UD, or undesired emergency, the industry term for a kicker. This happens when a single false valve somewhere in a 3-mile-long train malfunctions and tells the entire air system to dump its pressure instantly, slamming the brakes on every car at once. When this happens at 2:47 a.m. in a blizzard or a summer downpour, the engineer doesn't get to wait for a mechanic. The conductor has to climb down and walk the entire length of the train, all 3 miles of it, to find the car with the leak. They are looking for a hiss of air in a landscape of jagged ballast and pitch-black shadows, often carrying nothing but a pipe wrench and a spare air hose. Sometimes the fix is as primitive as using a wooden plug or a piece of cardboard to bypass a leaking gasket just to get the train moving again, so they don't block every road crossing in the county. It is a world of sophisticated microprocessors and satellite tracking, held together by field improvisations, and the sheer grit of people who are too tired to be scared. The technical spine of the railroad is a marvel of power ratings and thermal management, but it is currently being pushed to its absolute breaking point by a management philosophy that treats locomotives like toy trains on a carpet, ignoring the fact that when 20,000 tons of steel decides to stop behaving, no amount of corporate efficiency can stand in its way. But the technical precision and the grinding schedule are only half of the burden. The other half is a weight that doesn't show up on a freight manifest, but sits in the cab nonetheless, heavy and silent. As the early June heat begins to shimmer off the ballast, creating a mirage on the horizon, the statistics tell a story that recruitment brochures carefully omit. A locomotive engineer with a 25-year career will, on average, be involved in approximately 3 fatalities. This is not a maybe or a worst-case scenario. It is the statistical norm of the American mainline. Whether it is a trespasser using the tracks as a shortcut, a distracted driver trying to beat the crossing gates in a rush to get home, or a person who has decided to end their story under 20,000 tons of steel, the engineer is the one who has to watch it happen. From a quarter-mile away, they see the figure on the tracks. They hit the horn until it screams. They dump the air into emergency, and then they are forced to sit there for 45 seconds of absolute, agonizing helplessness while the train refuses to stop. A freight train takes over a mile to come to a halt, and in that time there is nothing left to do but stare through the glass. One engineer described the sound of the impact as a hollow thud that doesn't just stay in your ears, it vibrates in your teeth and settles into your bones forever. In the past, the industry response was as cold as the machinery itself. You were expected to finish your run, file the paperwork, and get back on the board for the next call. Today there are counseling programs and critical incident stress debriefings, which are objectively better than the silence of the 1970s. But they cannot erase the reality that your workplace is a cemetery of memories. The myth of the glamorous engineer is shattered by the record of cumulative trauma. You start to drink a little more to quiet the sound of the air brakes. You find yourself snapping at your family when you're finally home, because the exhaustion and the adrenaline have created a hair-trigger temper you don't recognize. This is where the shadow existence truly begins, a reversal of the dream where the hero of the rails becomes a ghost in his own house. A veteran Texas engineer once noted that living this life is like existing in a perpetual fog where you can't tell the difference between fatigue and your actual personality anymore. To survive the schedule, many have turned to a chemical cycle of stimulants to stay awake during the grueling 12-hour shifts, and sleeping pills to force their bodies into a coma during the erratic rest periods in cheap motels. It is a cycle of uppers and downers that erodes the nervous system until there is nothing left but a shell of the person who first walked into the hiring office. The records show that PTSD among rail workers is comparable to that of combat veterans, yet the railroad requires them to return to the exact mileposts where these tragedies occurred, day after day, month after month. One former engineer spoke of the ritual of passing a site of a past fatality and being unable to look away from that specific spot on the ballast for years. It wasn't until he realized he'd passed it without noticing that he felt he was finally beginning to heal. This is the hidden reversal of the industry. The job that was once a source of immense pride has become a test of psychological attrition. The paperwork may be filed, and the incident reports may be closed. But the engineer carries the record in his mind every time he notches the throttle forward and stares into the dark. The pandemic of 2020 served as the final jarring catalyst for a workforce already teetering on the edge of total burnout. When the world stopped moving, the railroads followed their precision-scheduled railroading playbook and furloughed thousands of crews to protect the bottom line and keep those operating ratios low. But when the economy roared back to life much faster than the corporate models predicted, The railroads found that their reserve of human capital had evaporated into the wind. Many of those engineers and conductors had spent their months away from the yard, discovering what it actually felt like to have a regular dinner with their families, to sleep in a stationary bed every single night, and to work jobs that didn't treat a sick child or a family funeral as a punishable disciplinary event. They simply didn't answer the recall letters. Even with six-figure salaries and comprehensive benefits back on the table, the value of lifetime had finally eclipsed the value of the paycheck. This massive labor vacuum triggered the explosive contract negotiations of 2022, where the primary sticking point wasn't the usual demand for higher wages. It was the basic, desperate plea for the human dignity of paid sick leave and predictable scheduling. While the railroads initially refused, arguing that the system was too complex to allow for unscheduled life events, the resulting public outcry and the threat of a national economic shutdown eventually forced a series of compromises. Some railroads like Union Pacific's have since begun testing pilot programs for more stable rosters, like the 11 on, 4 off schedule, but for the vast majority of the men and women out there, these are still just experiments on a distant horizon. In 2024 and continuing into this current year of 2026, we are seeing the structural consequences of this long-term neglect. Amtrak has had to cut service, oitsal routes and freight delays have become systemic, not because of a lack of cargo or fuel, but because the industry is suffering from a massive, self-inflicted shortage of qualified human beings. The veteran generation of engineers, the ones who possessed a deep, intuitive knowledge of how a train breathes and moves over the grades, is hitting retirement age and walking away the second they are eligible. And the younger generation is looking at the point systems and the missed birthdays and deciding that no amount of money is worth the trade. This is the sober reality that most rail documentaries skip over in favor of showing shiny engines, colorful liveries, and high-speed drone shots. We tend to compress the history of these companies into a series of bold mergers, corporate comebacks, and engineering triumphs, conveniently forgetting that every single mile of track was laid and every ton of freight is moved by a person who is likely fighting the urge to close their eyes. The mythic machine isn't just the GE or EMD locomotive at the front of the consist, it's the human being holding the throttle, and right now, that human machine is running on empty. As we look at the future of North American rail, we have to grapple with the fact that the efficiency gains of the last decade may have come at the cost of the profession's soul. The guy in Kansas we started with is still there, his boots are laced tight, and he's heading out into the pre-dawn darkness for another 12-hour shift. But he knows something the quarterly reports don't. No, you can only run a person into the ground for so long before the tracks finally run out. If you were offered $140,000 a year, but had to give up every weekend and holiday for the next decade, would you take the deal? Let us know in the comments if you think the railroad can ever truly be a golden job again.